Actually, it really, this particular conversation really rose in a conversation that Minister Brown and I had on an earlier occasion. When Minister Brown, in this conversation, referred to black people in this country as a nation within a nation. And I agree with that, but I informed him, but it was actually deeper than that. One, you have to agree with it because this was an assessment that Martin Delaney made in his book in about 1850 or so, called The Condition, where he actually described us as a nation within a nation. So we've heard this repeatedly by a lot of people, that we are a nation within a nation. Well, he was certainly one of the earlier proponents of that notion, and he derived that from the notion that we were unable to gain any political equality within this country, and therefore nobody fit that description more than our people. But what I told Mr. Brown at that point was that it would be fatal if we left it at only we were a nation within a nation. We also must recognize that the United States of America is a misnomer, because in effect it is really the United Nations of America. That this particular country from its beginning recognized the fact that nations could coexist, not just states out of 13 colonies, but nations. And the first recognition of that, that nobody can disagree with, is the fact that the indigenous people were given certain tribal sovereignties through treaties and things of that nature. You don't enter into treaties with people who are part of you. Treaties are entered in between two states, so to speak, in terms of international law. And so therefore we know that the fact that the indigenous people were able to have some semblance of sovereignty, even though it's questionable, you know, in terms of how they've been able to enjoy it, but we do know that. I mean, even up to the present time, the fact that gambling takes place on their grounds out of tribal sovereignty, the fact that there have been many whites who have been employed by these gambling casinos who've sued on civil rights grounds and have been told that they had no suits because these were tribal sovereignties in that nature. So we know
they are literally in another country, so to speak, when they're there on the reservation.
Right. And so that extension really also applies to a lot of other people, like the Mormons is a nation within a nation. The Catholic Church is already recognized as one of the political entities because of its status in Vatican City as a nation, its membership in the UN and other, and its diplomatic immunity that it enjoys. And then you have the Mormon Church that is also a sovereignty until itself out in Utah. So these sovereignties really exist under one umbrella. Now, what is interesting is, and a lot of people didn't necessarily comment on this, why did the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, for example, call it the Nation of Islam? You see, and in my opinion, he had to recognize the fact of him forming a theocracy and a government that may not necessarily be able to function ultimately within the confines of the United Nations of America, and therefore 5 separate states were demanded, but a government nonetheless. And then you had Yahweh ben Yahweh, who came and formed the Nation of Yahweh, also a recognition of the development of a government for black people. Now, the problem is that while other people have been able to enjoy this nationhood status in America, whites find it inconceivable for there to be a black nation, I mean, in this country. And therefore, people who have recognized the concept of sovereignty, going back to the Honorable Marcus Garvey, who recognized that even though he called it UNIA, but he was building a government nonetheless. And then the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who was in prison, and then Yahweh ben Yahweh, who is now in prison. And then you go even to the Black Panther Party, because when the Black Panther Party talks about power to the people, they're actually talking about popular sovereignty, you see, which is a concept that has been fought over for the last 200 years. George Wallace was shot because of his notion of sovereignty. You see, the right of the people of a territory, Alabama, to be the ultimate arbiters of how black folks are treated. That was his notion.
I'm glad you mentioned this because I wanted to hear your comments about this federal versus state dynamic, which you're bringing in now. Stretch that to other states in the South and give us some sense of what those states were saying, for example, in the quote-unquote civil rights era about their sovereignty.
Yeah, well, actually, going back really to the Civil War itself, the Civil War was fought over sovereignty because you actually had two nations coexisting at the same time. You had the nations of the South and you had the North, because they had two different cultures. One was an agricultural economy, the one was an industrial economy. And there was a whole question of who would regulate the other. They were seen as different, two accents. They were seen as two different nations. So the war was not fought over slavery. As a matter of fact, the Union could not have been fighting over slavery, because at the time they was conducting the war, the U.S. Constitution sanctioned slavery. So you couldn't be fighting something that your Constitution already sanctioned. So it really has something to do with the whole question of sovereignty and how men conduct their affairs. Now, sovereignty also, really, when you're talking about sovereignty to some extent, you can't forget the indigenous people, because much of what this country learned in terms of the natural rights of man came from the indigenous people, because they had no model in Europe, because there were monarchies in Europe and everybody was a subject.
What do you mean when you say the natural rights of man?
Well, basically, when the Europeans came here and they began to see the political institutions of the indigenous people, what they recognized was that those institutions was not coercive. I mean, you did not have magistrates and judges. You did not have jails and prisons and things of that nature. And it was a respect for every person's right. You didn't have poverty. You didn't have a clash over property or any of those things. You had total enjoyment of people. The Europeans had come from a land where there was a lot of poverty, a lot of famine, a lot of starvation, a lot of those things. So they began to admire that, but they had no model themselves in terms of, and so they used that model of the indigenous people in terms of recognizing that every man has rights that are endowed to him, and that those rights continue to exist until that man believes that it is more important that some of those rights are granted to a trustee, so to speak, in trust to protect the common good of all people. You know what I mean? It's like if we playing basketball, you playing basketball, we can play basketball, but at some point we say, hey man, we may do this better, we had a referee. You know what I mean?
Okay, yeah,
so, it doesn't start when playing basketball, but we get a right to make decisions on whether we foul to somebody else other than us.
I see.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But we have certain rights within ourselves, all right? Well, it was that basis from which the Declaration of Independence was written.
Hold on to that point, and I know that you have some thoughts. It was wild. They were saying that in one of the states out west, I don't remember if it was Nevada, Iowa, one of those states out there, they were saying that IRS agents don't even bring jury trials in this particular state because the state population is so conscious of sovereignty that they can't win the cases.
Yeah, well, you see, also, there's another reason for that, too.
Tell me.
You see,
Hold on.
you see, the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, well, see, it was around that time that there was an act called the Posse Comitatus Act of 1875. And what it did was, and it was enacted because it was to prevent standing armies in the South. Okay? Because you see, even going back to the formation of the U.S. Constitution, there was always a fear of a standing army, you know, and the dangers that it posed to a free people.
Right.
All right. So then when you had the military intervention in the South got Congress to pass the Posse Comitatus Act of 1875, which made the sheriff the highest ranking official in the county. You see, and so therefore, when a federal agent comes into that county, they're coming in illegally. So now what these militiamen have done is going back to that particular act, you see, and said, hey, this is it. Because, see, when the compromise was given in 1877 for Hayes, you know, to become president, well, what happened is that the parties agreed at that time that they would not pass any more civil rights acts. And they didn't until 1957.
Okay.
All right, and that there will be no further federal intervention into the affairs of the states. And that didn't happen again until 1957 when he sent the troops into Arkansas.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do.
See,
I do. And then we have a misnomer on our behalf as people that civil rights acts are occurring in the late 50s and early 60s.
Right.
And we can go back 100 years before that and find civil rights acts.
Right, sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because see, with the Act of 1866 and then the Act of 1875, the Act of 1866 allowed for people to enter the contracts and to buy property. Then the Act of 1875 was the Public Accommodations Act. Was ruled unconstitutional. And once that act was, around the time that act was ruled unconstitutional, then Tennessee became the first state to enact Jim Crow law. And then they started boomeranging. And then you got to a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, which dealt with that, you know, in terms of public transportation.
Yeah, now that's an interesting thing. Jim Crow laws.
Right.
Because it's not just a Jim Crow attitude.
Right, yeah.
It's not just a Jim Crow philosophy.
Right, yeah.
It's a Jim Crow law.
Right. And see, what happened was, see, there was a guy by the name of Rice, a white guy in Cincinnati, who, I think it was Dan Rice, who saw some blacks, children singing some song around the line of Jim Crow. You know, with some song that blacks had at that time.
Yeah.
And so he picked up that and went into a minstrel show act, you know, to degrade black
I remember reading that.
Right.
I remember reading that.
Right. And so then as a result of that, these laws were meant to degrade.
Jesus Christ. Oh, man. Boy, oh boy, oh boy.
It's a deep stuff.
The thing about it, though, and I know that it's some of what you referred to in your conversation is, this is the philosophical foundation of the country.
Right.
So when we really look at it, when we talk, they talk about the Republicans and what the Republicans are doing, they're really trying to go back to the foundation.
Right, yeah. In fact, I'm going to tell you what they're trying to do.
Okay.
It's worse than that.
All right, go ahead.
They're trying to go past, beyond the foundation.
Oh, Lord. Here we go.
All right. Don't give you an example.
All right.
Let's look at the slave codes.
Yeah, fine. Okay, good.
Now, the slave code denied basically all rights. But what it did guarantee, it guaranteed you food, clothing, and shelter.
All right, okay.
And it fined a master who refused to give those.
I've read that, yeah, okay. Yeah.
Now, Gendrich is going beyond that. He's not guaranteed to give you that.